It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. He who learns but does not think is lost. He who thinks but does not learn is in great danger. When anger rises, think of the consequences. Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. Respect yourself and others will respect you. To see what is right and not do it is the want of courage. Silence is a true friend who never betrays. The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. If you think in terms of a year, plant a seed. In 10 years, plant trees. In 100 years, teach the people. The superior man is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions. The cautious seldom err. Virtue is not left to stand alone. He who practices it will have neighbors. To govern is to correct. If you set the example, who will dare be incorrect? The noble-minded are calm and steady. The petty are always uneasy. Study the past if you would define the future. Life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. The expectations of life depend upon diligence. The craftsman must first sharpen his tools. Is it not a pleasure, having learned something, to practice it at proper times? A gentleman is ashamed to let his words outrun his deeds. Better a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without one. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. The strength of a nation derives from the integrity of the home. The will to win and the desire to succeed unlock personal excellence. Wheresoever you go, go with all your heart. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. Roads were made for journeys, not destinations. When goals cannot be reached, do not change the goals, change the actions. Success depends upon previous preparation. Without it, failure is sure. He who asks a question is a fool for a minute. He who does not ask is a fool for life. To see the right and not do it is cowardice. He who conquers himself is the mightiest warrior. Humility is the solid foundation of all virtues. The essence of knowledge is to apply it. To lack it is to admit it. To know what you know and to know what you do not know, this is knowledge. The superior man thinks of virtue. The small man thinks of comfort. Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. He who speaks without modesty finds it difficult to make his words good. The cautious seldom go wrong. A man who has made a mistake and does not correct it makes another mistake. The superior man is distressed by his own lack of ability, not by others' failure to recognize him. When we see men of worth, think of equaling them. When we see men of a contrary character, turn inward and examine ourselves. Virtue is more to man than water or fire. The more a man meditates on good thoughts, the better his world will be. Ignorance is the night of the mind, a night without moon or star. Learning without practice is like hearing without remembering. Only the wisest and the dullest of men never change. Choose a job you love, and you will never have to work a day in your life. No matter how busy you are, find time to read or yield to chosen ignorance. Knowing principles is not equal to loving them. Loving them is not equal to delighting in them. To lead by example is better than to rule by fear. The gentleman understands what is moral. The small man understands what is profitable. Hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. At home, be filial. Abroad, be respectful to elders. When the archer misses, he turns and seeks the cause within himself. The superior man seeks what is right. The inferior seeks what is profitable. Righteousness is the root of benevolence. When words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom. The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper names. If names are not correct, language will not be in accord with truth. Fine words and an insinuating appearance are seldom associated with true virtue. Renew yourself daily. Renew yourself once again. Renew yourself forever. You cannot open a book without learning something. To study and not think is waste. To think and not study is peril. When you know a thing, hold that you know it. When you do not, admit it. This is wisdom. He who excels in study may follow in public service. The gentleman stands in awe of heaven's mandate, great men, and the words of sages. Filial piety and fraternal respect are the root of benevolence. Ritual without reverence is empty. To love is benevolence. To do what is proper is righteousness. In teaching, there should be no class distinctions. From the lowly to the noble, all should devote themselves to learning. The benevolent love others. The wise understand others. If you err and do not correct it, you commit a second error. Do not be concerned that no one knows you. Seek to be worthy of being known. When you have faults, do not fear to abandon them. A gentleman makes demands on himself. A small man makes demands on others. Refrain from speaking until you have something worth saying. With coarse rice to eat, water to drink, and a bent arm for a pillow, joy may be found. The noble person is not a utensil. Cherish the old knowledge while continually acquiring the new, and you may teach others. He who will not economize will have to agonize. Be dignified without arrogance. Do not be arrogant without dignity. To see another's good and not imitate it is folly. The gentleman is easy to serve but hard to please. The small man is hard to serve but easy to please. Do not be concerned about having no office. Be concerned about having no ability for office. If you are upright, things go well without orders. If you are not, orders will not be obeyed. Lead with virtue and regulate with ritual. The people will become good. Lead with penalties. They will avoid punishment, yet lack shame. Keep promises with caution. The wise are free from perplexity, the virtuous from anxiety, the brave from fear. When you meet the worthy, think of equaling them. When you meet the unworthy, examine yourself. He who flatters me is my enemy. He who points out my faults is my teacher. To be wronged is nothing unless you keep remembering it. Be slow of speech and quick in action. not preach what you will not practice. In prosperity, do not be proud. In difficulty, do not be afraid. To rule by virtue is like the North Star, steady while all revolve around it. If righteousness seems costly, consider the price of shame. Do not seek a position, seek the fitness to hold one. Be strict with yourself and forgiving of others. Learning is a treasure that follows its owner everywhere. Respect the aged, cherish the young. This is humanity. Do not worry about failure. Worry about the chances you miss by not trying. Seek harmony without mere conformity. Avoid conformity without true harmony. When a person is trustworthy, trust them without suspicion. A heart set on righteousness is not swayed by profit. To be fond of learning is to be near wisdom. To practice with vigor is to be near benevolence. To know shame is to be near courage. Take the middle course, but do not be mediocre. Let words be faithful and actions reverent. Light a lantern within rather than complain of the night. The wise mend their faults as they go. If you cannot command yourself, you cannot command others. Be resolute and steadfast, yet gentle. Before promising, consider if you can keep it. Before speaking, consider if it is true. Learning is like rowing upstream. Not to advance is to fall back. Review what is old to learn what is new. A single word can elevate a state or ruin a family. Trustworthiness is the road, sincerity is the gate. Ritual refines desire, music harmonizes emotion. If the root is in order, the branches will flourish. Correct yourself rather than correct others. When you see profit, think of righteousness. When you see danger, be ready to give your life. If you lack faith, people will not stand with you. Be ashamed if your words outstrip your deeds. Kindness without firmness is weak. Firmness without kindness is harsh. The path of the noble is narrow but clear. When the heart is upright, the body follows. Do not be a vessel that holds resentment. Cultivate yourself, regulate the family, order the state. When heaven's wind blows, grass must bend. He who rushes ahead stumbles, he who moves steadily arrives. Let your face be friendly and your words sincere. Only with humility can learning enter. Value substance over ornament. The small man values ornament over substance. Ritual begins with respect, not display. Speak plainly, act faithfully, stand humbly. He who cannot forgive breaks the bridge he too must cross. Make demands of yourself, not excuses. Do not chase reputation, let virtue create it. Plant intention, water with practice, harvest character. If your heart is correct, the world will not sway you. Correct a small fault today rather than a great one tomorrow. Set high standards and begin with small steps. Teach by example and lead by service. Do not answer hastily. Do not decide in anger. Where there is trust, words are few. Do not be ashamed to seek help in doing right. Consider both sides carefully, then decide. Benevolence without wisdom wastes. Wisdom without benevolence wounds. Honor your parents in deed, not only in words. Eat simply, work earnestly, sleep at peace. Let your yes be honest and your no be kind. A crooked heart straightens nothing. Praise rarely, correct gently, encourage often. A clear name protects a clear path. A ruler who trusts only punishments teaches people to hide. A ruler who practices virtue teaches people to be honest. Cherish virtue more than comfort. If you would renew the people, first make your own heart upright. To know the mean is to avoid excess and deficiency. Benevolence begins under your own roof. When you are wrong, admit it quickly. When you are right, be still. Listen widely, question carefully, think thoroughly, judge wisely, act promptly. If you must compete, compete in virtue. Do not decorate truth, let it shine. A mind open to correction is a mind open to growth. Sincerity is the path of heaven. Seeking to be sincere is the path of man. Where ritual restrains, freedom can flourish. Be at ease with slow progress. Be uneasy with no progress. Let words be measured and the heart abundant. He who cannot endure the small will fail the great. A gentle word turns away wrath, a harsh one ignites it. Keep promises even when no one watches. When the family is correct, the state is stable. Hold fast to your root, branches will grow by themselves. Gratitude multiplies blessings. To be rich in virtue is better than to be rich in gold. A clear conscience is the pillow of the night. Learn widely, hold tightly to the good, follow what is right. The sea is made of drops, a gentleman is made of days. Do not defer goodness, it withers when delayed. A fault confessed is a fault half cured. Truth needs no adornment. If you correct yourself, you will seldom need to correct others. A house built on courtesy stands through storms. The hand that serves teaches more than the mouth that lectures. The noble mind seeks causes, the petty mind hunts excuses. Guard your thoughts, for conduct follows thought. Patience polishes rough intentions into deeds. Do not measure others by a rule you do not keep yourself. Prepare quietly, act openly, reflect deeply. Seek clarity before speed, purpose before praise. Let difficulty be your teacher, not your judge.